What's going on, YouTube? Thanks for tuning into the channel. Another chapter of Mastery, favorite book. This one is on part 5, Awaken the Dimensional Mind, the creative active phase. So the overall story they uses to talk about this is Wolfgang Mozart, and basically this is called the second transformation. So basically Mozart was, his dad Leopold really put him through a very intense rigorous apprenticeship, but basically he is going to be he is like the breadwinner. Him and his sister are doing these acts. They're like this little kid, little guy, little girl kind of duo, making a lot of money. Eventually it gets to the point where they're like too old to do this whole act, and long story short, Mozart gets this job as the count musician. His dad gets him the job. It kind of kept their family still in the same limelight that his dad wanted, and his dad was always like his manager, person that trained him everything. But basically this was like a glorified, like, it had a great title and like guest status, but like in terms of production he was basically just like errand boy kind of thing. So he always had this feeling he was going to die early. That was like some weird intuition he had. So basically he breaks it off with his dad. They never speak again. He moves to Salzburg. That's where he created all of his great works were created right after that rift. So the keys to mastery is what Robert Greene calls 3 things: the original mind, the conventional mind, and the dimensional mind. So the original mind is like, we're born, you know, you're just kind of your natural instincts, your natural inclinations. There's not a lot of like BS and bullshit that's clouding your mind. The conventional mind is when you start to learn the conventions. You start to learn how things work, and if you're talking about any kind of field, it's like the sacred cows. You start learning the ropes and the way things work. And then the dimensional mind is the mind where it still has the creativity of the original mind, but it has the discipline and understanding of the conventional mind. So it's a disciplined original mind with knowledge and convention. Now he kind of talks about it as, you know, we all start with somewhat of an original mind and maybe have different inclinations towards one. You gain the convention, but a lot of people lose their original mind and only believe in the convention. People who become masters never lose the original mind, and then they're able to have that best of both worlds where they have a highly disciplined creative original mind. So step 1 is the creative task. So creativity is more emotional than intellectual, and that's a main point he makes throughout the book. And the whole thing about achieving mastery is that you're going to have to pick something that you're definitely very passionate about. And he calls this the primary law of the creative dynamic, that how into your work basically you are will directly reflect in the work that you create. And this is going to be so much work, you know, 8 to 10 to 12 years is a ridiculous amount of time, that, you know, obviously you want it to be something that you're very into. And he really just says there's kind of 2 things. He talks about the fact that, 1, you're going to have to lose your need for comfort and security, and that also it needs to be something you're passionate about, but also large, because anything, it's like a corollary law of the creative dynamic, that you'll rise to the occasion of any task. Step 2 is the creative strategies. And basically his whole idea is that your mind is a muscle. It tightens up when you don't use it, and it's kind of twofold, because your brain generally likes to think in the same ways and not be used in creative ways, because it makes the brain more efficient. First, and I'm going to skip a lot of the stories as I did in the last video, he starts with A, and that's cultivate negative capability. What the idea of negative capability is that you have the ability of holding 2 opposing thoughts without coming to a conclusion or creating cognitive dissonance in your mind. So the whole idea here is that the world is in constant flux. For anything to be super black and white is almost insane to believe that it's going to be that true. Generally, there's truth in both sides of the story, and being able to hold that and ponder upon that to come up with before you come to a conclusion is really the basis of creativity, is that you can assess all options and let things happen. B is allowing for serendipity. So many great ideas or breakthroughs happen when you're actually not even working, when you're taking a shower, when you're on a walk, right before you go to sleep. Everybody has those times where they come up with a great idea when they have that little bit of space in what you're doing. So allowing yourself that opportunity for serendipity, going into places where things might happen. And generally, I don't even know if this was in Mastery, but he's mentioned it before, that serendipity is generally more a function of the openness of your mind rather than actually things happening in this crazy coincidental type of manner. C is alternate the mind through the current. And what he talks about here is that just the tendency to jump to conclusions. Generally, we have this feeling that it's usually one or the other. Either people want to emotionally jump to a conclusion that something is a certain way without actually, gaining all of the data and actually gathering information to actually speculate on it. They just want to speculate off the bat, off their emotions, off of what they already think in their preconceived notions. And then on the other idea, it's they just like to gather a lot of information and never speculate, never really jump to a side or try to make a conclusion or test it out. So he kind of talks about running through the current, not short-circuiting it like our typical culture likes us to do. It's generally whatever profession you're in, it's one or the other is the typical, or whatever you're learning is the typical method of doing it, but actually alternating through the current, in the idea of like a product in a marketplace, one, creating the prototype, but not just believing that your prototype is the best shit since sliced bread because you thought about it and have an emotional attachment in it. Send it to the market and see what the market says, and then respond to that feedback. And that's what he means by alternate the mind through the current. Is that you speculate on something, then you test it, and then you take the feedback and run it through again, and not short-circuiting the current and getting too emotional with your first idea, or being so scared to come up with an idea that all you do is stack a bunch of papers. So the D is alter your perspective, and he kind of goes through a lot of different kind of ways of this. So really just kind of thinking out your normal field of vision. Our mind generally likes to use shortcuts. It just makes it more efficient, as I mentioned before, and it doesn't really overwhelm the brain. But instead of looking at, at the what, looking at more of the what instead of the how of the way things are. And generally the way that our mind works is we like to, jump to generalities instead of focusing on details. So if there's details can fuck up what we already had in our brain as a preconceived notion, or putting that into a category, what we'll do is we'll like to generalize to kind of assuage that cognitive dissonance. But on the other hand, you don't want to be so caught up in the details that you don't see the picture as the whole. So that's really the other side of the monster, is that one, we like to make those shortcuts to do things, but there are instances where you can't focus on every little detail or you won't make any progress. And another way of kind of, alternating your perspective is instead not confirming paradigms and ignoring anomalies. So generally in any field of study or research, there are paradigms already there. And if you think about science, and this is generally a lot of the times where I'm very skeptical when people are like, oh, science proves, because generally people already have a way of thinking or a hypothesis that they've already thought up before they come up with a study. So they've created a study to confirm what they've already thought. And then when there are anomalies or outliers, generally those are very easily, and to kind of jump it back, just generalize, oh, well, just because those are out there, that doesn't mean that I'm not right. This doesn't mean that, and he kind of looks at it that actually the anomalies those are the opportunities, because generally those are actually flaws in the system that you're using. And one great example that's actually not in the book, but it was like a story that I heard in another book just recently, was they're doing this, it's like in World War II, they're doing a study about airplanes, and they're trying to judge, where do we strengthen the plane to make it the most fortified. And the way that they thought about it was, they're like, you know, it looks like on the sides that they're always getting shot up the most, in the front's getting shot up, and then the back's kind of getting shot up the most. And they're like, so that's what we need to reinforce. And so they already kind of thought that, and then they did their studies. They're like, yeah, we can reinforce it here, and look, it's not getting hurt through that. And that's kind of like, they're reinforcing the idea, they're helping. And then the other guy decides, he goes, actually, I think it's the bottom of the plane that needs to be reinforced. The fact that we don't see the planes landing with those shots is because they're being downed immediately when they're hit there, and that's the most vulnerable. And that's kind of coming from the anomaly. Why don't we ever see bullet shots there? Because that is the least, and that's the opportunity. That's the least strong part of the whole system. So E is actually reverting to primal forms of intelligence. So generally, when you think about it, you know, words, culture, all of these different things that we have in our mind, you know, math and these different concepts, you know, a lot of the times they actually limit our thinking. And there's so many primal abilities we have that, especially in this modern world, if you're in any kind of modernized society, you know, we've kind of lost a lot of tap into. And there's a theory called the superior wharf hypothesis that is kind of like, our whole world is shaped by our language, that the words we have that's the way we think. And he's kind of suggesting, you know, to think more into a primal way, more into just images, more into instincts, you know, feeling, just getting back to, you know, the intuitive way. And a lot of the times that's where creativity is spawned, because you know, why is not a robot not creative? Because they don't have those primal instinctive urges. They don't have that personality. And that's kind of a very important piece. And it was kind of cool was the last part, because things are generally not as simple and able to be broken down as we like to think. You know, there is this idea that everything is kind of flowed together, and it is in a pre-verbal situation. You want to learn about the whole thing, not just learn, you know, what somebody else says and follow that, when, you know, the truth is often seen, not heard. So step 3 here is the creative breakthrough, tensions and insight. You know, masters often start out you know, with extreme vigor. Everybody does. You know, start with extreme vigor when you want to finish something, but then often their high standards kind of overwhelms them, and they get to a point where they feel like they're forcing it. You know, they're forcing the issue. They take a break, and that's where the breakthrough comes to them. And generally, where your frustrations and your doubts and your insecurities are coming from, those are actually really a lot of the times the best place for being the birthing place of these big breakthroughs. Generally, there's also some emotional pitfalls that we fall into on our path to mastery as well. So these would be complacency. So obviously getting complacent with the spot you're at, getting comfortable. Conservatism, you know, not wanting to make that jump, make that leap, pushing yourself to that extra spot where, you know, there is some risk on the table. Dependency, maybe, you know, you got yourself into a situation where you're dependent on somebody else to contribute or make that production that would make you a master in whatever you're doing. Impatience, not being able to endure the 10,000 plus hours that it takes to actually master a craft. Then it would be grandiosity, you know, being, you know, too big, too grandiose, where it's all about your ego, and you know, your any failure you have is kind of earth-shattering, because, you know, you've been so grandiose that it's too much each time. And then lastly, it would really be inflexibility, not being able to let the process kind of work out the way it needs to work out, and being flexible that, you know, your original thought might not be the original end that you're looking for. So we all want to feel more connected to reality and to other people in our culture. And I mean, obviously I'm part of it too. You know, they suggest a lot of drugs and alcohol to get this feeling. Creativity is really and being so successful and a master at a creative endeavor is really the way that he's suggesting that you get this feeling. And it's a very arduous and painful process, but there's a great reward at the end.